Marcus Carter hurried through the elementary school hallway, concrete dust still clinging to his jeans, the sweat on his deep brown skin barely dried from a long day on the construction site. He could feel paint flecks on his work boots and grit under his nails, and all he could think was that he had shown up looking like this to parent-teacher night. He was late again, already convinced he was failing at this single dad thing. Then he saw her. Emma Rodriguez stood near the classroom door, polished and composed in a silk blouse and tailored slacks, like she belonged to a world that had never once worried about overdue bills. 10 years had passed since she disappeared without a word. 10 years of silence and unanswered questions. Their eyes met, and the past slammed into the present so hard that neither of them seemed ready for impact. Marcus had not planned to look this rough. His shift had run over at the site, and by the time he remembered the parent-teacher meeting, there hadn't been a spare minute to go home and change. He had splashed water on his face in the site trailer, tried to brush the dust from his dark work jeans, and driven straight to Pine Valley Elementary with his steel-toe boots still caked in mud. Aaliyah deserved better than a dad who looked like he'd just climbed out of a construction pit. But she also deserved a father who showed up, even tired and dusty, and that was the one promise Marcus had never broken. The hallway smelled like crayons and floor wax. Colorful drawings lined the walls, each one signed with a child's uneven handwriting. Marcus spotted a picture of a house under a crooked sun with the name Alias C written in the corner. Despite everything, he smiled. His daughter had clearly inherited her mother's artistic streak, though she would never know that part of the story. Laura had been gone for 5 years now, taken by an illness that moved faster than anyone could fight. Marcus had been both mother and father to Aaliyah ever since, and most days he felt like he was barely holding either role together. Then he saw Emma standing beside Mrs. Patterson's classroom, and the rest of the hallway dissolved. Emma Rodriguez looked nothing like the girl who had vanished from his life 10 years earlier. That girl had worn thrift store jeans, laughed too loud, and kissed him behind the bleachers after football games, her hands tangled in his short, tight curls while she swore they'd get out of this town together. The woman in front of him wore a silk blouse that probably cost more than his weekly paycheck. Her hair was perfectly styled, her posture straight and confident, her whole presence radiating the kind of controlled power that belonged in boardrooms, not elementary school corridors. She clutched a stack of picture books to her chest like a shield. When her gaze locked with his, something flickered across her face. Recognition, shock, and something softer he couldn't name. Marcus's feet stopped moving. His heart didn't. Marcus! His name on her lips sounded strange, like a word she hadn't had reason to say in years. Maybe she hadn't. He wanted to say something that would slice straight to the damage she'd left behind. Something sharp enough to make her feel even a fraction of the hurt he'd carried when she disappeared without a word, without a note, without anything that resembled an explanation. That summer, he had checked his phone every hour, driven past her house until her parents finally told him she was gone. Just gone. No address, no forwarding number, no goodbye, only silence and a wound that never properly healed. But standing here now, concrete dust on his jeans and 10 years of questions burning a hole in his chest, all he managed was her name in return. Emma. The classroom door opened and Mrs. Patterson stepped out with her bright, practiced teacher smile. She glanced between them with the cheerful obliviousness of someone who had no idea she just interrupted a collision of past and present. Mr. Carter, I'm so glad you could make it. And I see you've already met our reading volunteer. Miss Rodriguez has been wonderful with the children, especially Aaliyah. Your daughter absolutely lights up during reading hour. The words landed one by one. Reading volunteer, Aaliyah, your daughter. Emma had been spending time with his child. Emma, the girl who had once vanished without a trace, who had left him shattered and confused, had somehow drifted into the one part of his life that mattered more than anything else. He looked at her, searching for some hint that this was deliberate, some edge that said she'd orchestrated all of this on purpose. But her expression was carefully neutral, the kind of blankness that looked like it had been practiced in mirrors and boardrooms. I didn't know, Emma said quietly, as if she could hear what he was thinking. When I signed up to volunteer, I had no idea Aaliyah was your daughter. Carter's a common name. I only realized today when I saw the emergency contact form. Marcus didn't know whether to believe her. He didn't know if it even mattered. The parent-teacher meeting passed in a fog. Mrs. Patterson talked about Aaliyah's reading, how quickly she absorbed stories, how kind she was with classmates, how easily she drifted into daydreams during math. Marcus nodded at the right times, signed the forms he was supposed to sign, but his attention kept sliding toward Emma, sitting 2 chairs away, hands folded, eyes fixed anywhere but on him. When the meeting ended, he picked Aaliyah up from the after-school room and headed toward the parking lot, silently promising himself he would not look back. He looked back. Emma stood near the entrance, watching them walk away. The polished CEO look had slipped just a little, revealing something beneath it that looked painfully like longing or maybe regret. Marcus kept moving. "Daddy, that's Miss Emma," Aaliyah said, tugging on his hand. "She reads to us every Tuesday and Thursday. She does all the voices and everything. She's my favorite." Marcus's chest tightened. "Is that right?" "She smells like flowers," Aaliyah went on, completely unaware of the weight behind her words. "And she always picks the best stories. Can we invite her for dinner sometime? I want to show her my book collection." The innocence cut deeper than any accusation could have. Aaliyah had lost her mother so young that her memories of Laura were more stories than images. She craved a gentle, steady female presence in her life, with a hunger that broke Marcus's heart every time he noticed it. And now, here was Emma, slipping into that empty space like it had been carved just for her. They reached the truck. Marcus buckled Aaliyah into her booster seat, then stood there with his hand on the door, thoughts racing. He could request a different reading volunteer. He could pull Aaliyah from the program completely. He could build walls high enough and thick enough that Emma would never get close to either of them again. Or he could do the thing that scared him most. The following Tuesday, Marcus arrived 20 minutes early. He found Emma shelving picture books in the school library, handling each one with the careful precision of someone who respected even the smallest tasks. She looked up at the sound of his boots on the carpet, and her expression shifted through surprise, wariness, and something like hope before finally settling into caution. "I need to know why you left," Marcus said, skipping past hello. 10 years, Emma. You owed me at least a goodbye." Emma set the book in her hands onto the cart. "I know, and I'm sorry, but the answer is complicated, and this isn't the place." "Then tell me somewhere else." The words came out before he could swallow them. "Aaliyah wants to invite you for dinner. I'm not saying yes until I know what happened, but I'm not saying no either." Something cracked in Emma's gaze. For a heartbeat, he saw the girl he used to know underneath the professional polish, the one who stole fries off his plate, argued about music, and made him believe love was simple. "Friday," Emma said. "I'll bring dessert." Marcus should have refused. Every sensible part of his brain warned that letting her back in could only end badly. But Aaliyah's face lit up when he told her, and that was enough to quiet the alarm bells. His daughter had spent too many years in a home that echoed with absence. If Emma could fill even a small piece of that emptiness, even briefly, maybe the risk was worth taking. Friday arrived faster than he expected. Marcus cleaned their small apartment twice, hiding the unpaid bills he didn't want anyone to see, and arranging Aaliyah's drawings on the fridge like they were works in a gallery. He made spaghetti because it was the only dish he could cook that was almost guaranteed not to burn. He set the table with the good plates Laura had picked out back when they believed they had all the time in the world. He rarely used them anymore. Nice things had started to feel like they belonged to another life. Emma showed up at 6 o'clock with a store-bought pie and a nervous smile. She complimented the apartment, admired Aaliyah's artwork, and asked the kind of questions only someone who was actually listening would ask. About school, favorite stories, and the exact shade of purple Aaliyah liked best. Aaliyah blossomed under the attention, talking nonstop about everything from her best friend to her dream of becoming a veterinarian. Marcus watched them, scanning for any sign of manipulation or hidden motives. He didn't find any. There was just a woman who seemed honestly enchanted by his daughter and a little girl who had been starving for exactly that kind of warmth. After dinner, Aaliyah insisted on showing Emma her bookshelf. Marcus stayed behind in the kitchen, washing dishes and listening to their voices float down the hallway. He couldn't remember the last time the apartment had sounded so alive, so full. And that terrified him. The weeks that followed felt like stepping into someone else's world. Emma became a regular presence in the Carter home, coming by most Sundays for dinner and sometimes swinging past on weekday evenings with takeout and new picture books. Marcus watched Aaliyah change under this constant, gentle attention, shifting from a quiet, wary child into someone who laughed more freely and talked about her future with genuine excitement. He told himself this was enough. He told himself he could keep his walls up while still allowing Aaliyah this gift. But the more Emma sat at his table, the more the questions grew inside him, like weeds pushing through cracked concrete. Emma said she worked as a business consultant. It was a vague explanation, but it fit the flexible hours that let her show up at school, readings, and Sunday dinners without ever seeming rushed or overbooked. Still, small details didn't line up. Her car was a sleek black sedan that probably cost more than Marcus earned in a year. Even her casual clothes carried the subtle markers of expensive taste that he recognized from working in luxury homes. She never mentioned coworkers, never complained about bosses or deadlines, never told the petty work stories everybody else seemed to have. It was like her job existed in a vacuum. One evening, Marcus noticed her watch. It was small and understated, but the kind of understated that screamed money to anyone who'd ever spent time around wealthy clients. He didn't know brands, but he knew that piece hadn't come from a mall kiosk. "That's a nice watch," he said, trying to sound casual. Emma glanced at her wrist as if she'd forgotten she was wearing it. "A gift from a client who was happy with my work." Marcus nodded and swallowed his doubts. But the answer sat wrong with him, joining all the other little inconsistencies that were adding up to something bigger. Aaliyah didn't see any of that. To her, Emma was the magical grown-up who knew every fairy tale, remembered every stuffed animal's name, and never forgot which joke had made Aaliyah giggle the hardest the week before. They built their own routines, Emma arriving with a new book each week, Aaliyah demanding they read it together on the edge of her bed before dinner. Sometimes Marcus stood in the doorway, watching Emma's arm around his daughter's small shoulders, their heads bent together over the pages. It looked like the family picture he'd stopped letting himself dream about. But beneath the warmth, his insecurity grew. He came home every day covered in sawdust and sweat, his deep brown hands still rough from work, while Emma arrived smelling like expensive perfume and leather car seats. He served dinner on mismatched plates, while she probably held meetings at restaurants that required reservations weeks in advance. He was the man who had to double-check his account before buying groceries. Emma casually mentioned conferences in cities he'd only ever seen in movies. The distance between their worlds stretched wider every week, and Marcus couldn't understand why someone like her kept showing up in his cramped two-bedroom, sitting at his scratched kitchen table with him and his 8-year-old daughter. Maybe she felt guilty about walking out all those years ago. Maybe this was some twisted version of making amends. Or maybe she was playing a game he didn't understand. The answer came on an ordinary Thursday in the most unexpected way. His foreman called a site meeting to announce that the project was ahead of schedule. The investors were thrilled, he said, and if they kept up the pace, there would be bonuses for everyone. It was the kind of good news that meant Marcus might finally be able to fix the truck's transmission and take Aaliyah to the zoo like he'd been promising for months. He stood with the rest of the crew, half listening while he did the math in his head. Then the foreman mentioned the investor's name, Rodriguez Development Group. Something cold slid into Marcus's chest. That evening, instead of going straight home, he drove to the public library. He logged on to one of the old computers, the kind that hummed and flickered, and typed the company name into the search bar. The results loaded slowly, and each line hit harder than the last. Rodriguez Development Group wasn't some anonymous firm. It was a family empire, one of the largest real estate developers in the state. Its CEO, who had taken over from her father 3 years earlier and tripled the company's portfolio, was Emma Rodriguez. The photo on the company website showed a version of Emma he barely recognized. She wore a tailored suit, standing confidently in front of a gleaming office building, her expression polished and distant. The biography beneath the photo listed her degrees, her milestones, her vision for sustainable urban development. It said nothing about volunteering at schools, reading picture books, or eating spaghetti in a cramped apartment with a construction worker and his daughter. Marcus stayed until the library closed, reading article after article about her success. She'd been featured in business magazines, interviewed on local news, named one of the most influential young executives in the region. The girl who had vanished 10 years ago hadn't disappeared. She'd risen into a world so far removed from his own that their teenage romance felt like a story he'd invented. And once again, she hadn't told him the truth. He drove home in a fog of anger and disbelief. Aaliyah was already asleep when he walked in. The babysitter was paid and sent home. Marcus stood in his daughter's doorway for a long moment, watching her breathe. This small human who trusted him to make good choices for her. He had opened their door to Emma. He had let her read stories, share meals, and become someone Aaliyah looked for every week. And the entire time, Emma had been hiding who she really was. The next morning, Marcus called in sick for the first time in 3 years. When Emma texted to ask if she could drop by that evening, he sent back 3 words. "Don't come over." Her reply came fast. "Marcus, what's wrong? Can we talk?" He didn't answer. The next few days were some of the hardest Marcus had faced since Laura died. Aaliyah couldn't understand why Miss Emma had suddenly stopped visiting. She asked questions he couldn't answer, her face moving from confusion to disappointment, and then settling into a quiet sadness that hurt more than any argument. He told her Emma was busy with work, that adults sometimes had to focus on their jobs, that it wasn't anyone's fault. The lie tasted bitter, but he didn't know how to explain the truth when he barely understood it himself. Emma tried every way she could think of to reach him. Calls, texts, emails, even a handwritten letter in his mailbox with his name in her neat script. Marcus ignored them all. He couldn't face her without either shutting down or blowing up. And if he exploded, he'd shatter whatever fragile piece Aaliyah still had. So he chose silence, the same weapon Emma had used on him a decade ago. 2 weeks into that standoff, Emma showed up at the construction site. Marcus spotted her car first, the sleek black sedan sitting among dusty pickup trucks like a dropped diamond. Then he saw her near the site trailer talking with his foreman, dressed in jeans and a simple blouse, her hair pulled back. No trace of the glossy CEO from those websites. When she noticed him watching, she said something to the foreman, then walked straight toward him with determined steps. "You can't ignore me forever," she said when she reached him. Marcus dragged his work gloves off and wiped his hands on his jeans, buying time. Around them, the other workers pretended to focus on their tasks, throwing quick, curious glances his way. "Watch me," he said. Emma's jaw tightened. "I know you found out about the company. I know you're angry, but you still don't have the full story, Marcus. You never did." "The full story?" His voice came out flat. "You mean the part where you're the CEO of the company funding this project? The part where you've been pulling up to my place in that expensive car, pretending you're just some consultant, watching me count every dollar while you probably spend more on lunch than I make in a week?" Emma flinched, but didn't retreat. "I didn't tell you because I knew this is what you'd see. The money, the title. I knew you'd assume it meant I was playing some kind of game, but I'm not. I came back to Pine Valley for reasons that had nothing to do with business. I started volunteering at the school before I knew Aaliyah existed. Meeting her, meeting you again, wasn't part of some plan." Marcus wanted to believe her. Part of him, the part that still remembered the girl who stole fries off his plate and swore she'd always be in his corner, ached to accept that explanation and move on. But trust, once broken, didn't snap back into place. And Emma had broken his twice. "Why did you leave?" he asked, the words rough in his throat. 10 years ago. Why did you disappear?" Emma's expression shifted, something raw moving behind her eyes. "I can't answer that here, not like this." "Can't or won't?" "Both." She took a breath, steadying herself. "But there's something I need you to know. I'm withdrawing Rodriguez Development Group from this project. As of this morning, we're no longer the investors." Marcus stared at her. "That's a multi-million-dollar job." "I know exactly what it is," Emma said quietly. "And I can't stay involved in something that directly affects your livelihood. It's a conflict of interest I'm not willing to juggle." Her voice was even, but Marcus could see the strain in her shoulders and the tight set of her mouth. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," she added. "I'm not asking for anything. I just need you to understand I'm trying to make this right." She turned away, and he should have let her go. He should have accepted that gesture as the closure she clearly meant it to be and walked back to his small, predictable life. Instead, he heard himself say, "Come to dinner on Saturday." Emma stopped but didn't turn around. "Aaliyah misses you," Marcus continued. "So do I. One dinner. You answer every question I have, honestly. After that, we figure out what comes next. For a long stretch of silence, she didn't respond. Then finally she nodded. Saturday, she said. Saturday arrived heavy with expectation. Marcus cleaned the apartment again, more out of anxiety than necessity. Aaliyah had been buzzing with excitement since he told her Miss Emma was coming back, and her joy felt like both a blessing and pressure. Whatever truth came out tonight, Marcus had to find a way to shield his daughter from the fallout. Emma showed up at 6 o'clock on the dot, holding flowers instead of dessert. She looked softer somehow, like she'd shed some invisible armor since the day at the site. Dinner was calmer than usual. Conversation stayed on safe topics. Aaliyah carried it, talking about school, friends, and a book report she was worried about. Marcus and Emma moved around one another carefully, like planets aware of each other's gravity but afraid of collision. Afterward, Aaliyah asked if Emma would read her a bedtime story. Marcus said yes, and for 20 minutes he stood in the living room listening to their voices from down the hall, Emma doing all the voices just like Aaliyah had described that first night. When Emma finally stepped out of the bedroom and closed the door quietly behind her, her eyes were rimmed with red. She's asleep, Emma said. Marcus nodded toward the small balcony overlooking the parking lot. Let's talk outside. The air was cool, carrying distant traffic noise and music drifting up from a radio somewhere below. They stood at the railing, shoulder to shoulder but not touching, both staring out at the city lights instead of at each other. Marcus waited. He'd asked for the truth. Now it was her turn to decide what to give him. When Emma finally spoke, her voice was almost a whisper. I was pregnant, Marcus, 10 years ago. That's why I left. The words didn't make sense at first. They fell into his mind like puzzle pieces from the wrong picture. Pregnant, 10 years ago. The summer right after graduation. The last summer they'd had before she vanished. I found out a week after graduation, Emma went on, eyes fixed on the horizon. I was 18, terrified, with parents who had just finalized their divorce, and a mother who made it very clear I only had one option if I wanted to stay part of the family. Sha swallowed. She gave me a choice, get rid of it or get out. Marcus's fingers tightened on the railing until his knuckles went white against his deep brown skin. You could have told me. I know, her voice cracked. I should have. I wanted to. But my mother convinced me that telling you would wreck your life. You had that apprenticeship lined up, your first real job. She said if I told you, you'd feel obligated to marry me, to give up everything, and I'd drag you down. I was 18 and scared, and I believed her. She turned then, tears streaming silently down her face. I chose to keep the baby, Marcus. I chose you and that child over my family's money and my mother's approval. I moved in with my aunt in another state, got a job, started taking night classes. I was going to wait until the baby was born and then find you, tell you everything, give us a chance to be a family. Cold dread crept into Marcus's chest. He knew what question came next, but forcing himself to say it felt like pushing against a wall. What happened? His voice sounded like it belonged to someone else. I lost the baby at 7 months, Emma said, closing her eyes. Something went wrong. The doctor said it happens sometimes, no one's fault, just bad luck. But it didn't feel like luck. It felt like punishment. Silence pressed in around them. Marcus stood frozen, trying to absorb the weight of what she'd just shared. 10 years ago, while he was cursing her name and trying to forget her, Emma had been grieving a child he'd never even known existed. His child, a son or daughter who had lived and died without his knowledge. I couldn't face you afterward, Emma continued, words spilling out now as if a dam had broken. I couldn't look at you knowing what I'd lost, what we'd lost. So I buried myself in work and building something so big I thought it might make the pain worth it. I kept telling myself I'd find you when I'd healed, when I had something to offer besides grief. But years passed and healing never came, and eventually I convinced myself you were better off without me. Marcus didn't speak, couldn't. The anger he'd carried for a decade was dissolving, replaced by something heavier. Grief for a child he'd never hold, fury at the circumstances that had stolen that chance. And underneath it, a terrible understanding of why Emma ran. In her broken, misguided way, she'd thought she was protecting him, trying to spare him pain. Instead, she'd condemned both of them to 10 years of it. Marcus didn't sleep that night. After Emma left, he sat on the balcony until the sky paled, turning the same thoughts over like stones in his hands. A child. His child. Someone who had existed for 7 months, growing and changing, with a heartbeat and a future that never arrived. He tried to picture that baby, whether they would have had his eyes or Emma's smile, tight curls or straight hair, whether they would have been a boy or a girl. Every image dissolved as soon as he reached for it, leaving nothing but ache. The anger was still there, but it had shifted. He was angry at Emma for making decisions alone, angry at her mother for forcing an 18-year-old into an impossible corner, angry at the universe for taking something so fragile before he even knew it was there. Underneath all of that lived a grief so deep it threatened to pull him under. He had lost a child. He had lost Emma. And for 10 years he'd been walking around with wounds he couldn't name. Aaliyah found him outside when she woke up. She climbed into his lap without a word, the way she always did when she sensed something was wrong. Marcus wrapped his arms around her and breathed in the familiar scent of her hair, grounding himself in the reality of the child who was here, who was alive, who needed him even when the ground under his feet felt unstable. "Are you sad, Daddy?" she asked, voice still thick with sleep. Marcus considered lying. He had become good at smoothing out the rough edges of adult problems for her, disguising storms as clouds. "Yeah, baby," he said quietly. "I'm sad about something that happened a long time ago." Aaliyah thought about that. "Miss Emma looks sad too," she said. "When she read to me last night, her voice got all wobbly in the sad part." Marcus closed his eyes. Even in the middle of her own pain, Emma had shown up for his daughter. She had read the story with funny voices, tucked Aaliyah in, and saved her own tears for after the bedroom door closed. That had to matter. The next few days blurred into routine. Marcus went to work. He picked Aaliyah up from school. He cooked dinners they barely tasted. He didn't call Emma, but he didn't block her either. He was waiting for clarity, for courage, or simply for the strength to feel what he'd spent 10 years avoiding and still keep going. It was Aaliyah who finally forced a decision. They were eating boxed macaroni and cheese on a Wednesday night. Aaliyah pushed noodles around her plate, uncharacteristically quiet, until she finally looked up with eyes that held too much understanding for an 8-year-old. "Daddy, are you and Miss Emma fighting?" Marcus set his fork down. "It's complicated, sweetheart." "That's what grown-ups say when they don't want to explain," Aaliyah said matter-of-factly. "But I'm not a baby. I know something happened. Miss Emma hasn't come over in forever, and you've been sad, and I just want to know if she's coming back." The simple question cut through every defense Marcus had built. He looked at his daughter, this little girl who had already lost one woman she loved and was terrified of losing another. She deserved a father who made choices out of hope, not fear. "I don't know if she was coming back," he admitted, "but I think I need to find out." He called Emma that night after Aaliyah fell asleep. She answered on the second ring, her voice careful and braced. "I need to see you," Marcus said, "not at my place, somewhere neutral. We need to finish this conversation." They met on a park bench near the elementary school. From where they sat, they could see the hallway where they'd collided weeks earlier through the chain-link fence. It was late evening, the playground was empty, the only sounds the hum of traffic and a few birds settling in for the night. Emma sat on one end of the bench, Marcus on the other. The space between them felt crowded with everything they hadn't said. "I've been thinking about what you told me," Marcus began. "About the baby, about why you left. And I keep circling back to the same question." Emma waited. "Do you regret it?" he asked. "The choice you made?" Her answer came slowly. "I regret how I handled everything. I regret shutting you out and making decisions for both of us. I regret running and hiding and letting 10 years go by without facing what happened." She turned to him. "But I don't regret choosing to keep our child, even though it ended the way it did. That baby was real, Marcus. For 7 months, I loved someone who was part of both of us. Losing them almost destroyed me. But I wouldn't trade those months for anything." Something shifted in Marcus's chest. The anger that had occupied so much space loosened its grip, making room for something else. Understanding, or maybe the first fragile piece of acceptance. "I wish you'd told me," he said, voice low. "I wish I'd been there." "I know," Emma whispered, "and I'm sorry. I'll be sorry for the rest of my life." They sat in silence, watching shadows lengthen across the empty playground. When Marcus spoke again, his voice was steadier. "Aaliyah asked me today if you're coming back. She misses you, and I do too. Not the CEO on the website. The girl who stole fries from me and argued about music and made me think everything might just work out." He looked at her. "Is that person still in there?" Emma's eyes filled with tears. but she didn't look away. She never left, she said. She just got buried under a lot of armor. Then take off the armor, Marcus said. No more secrets. No more hiding who you are or what you want. If we're going to try this, if we're going to give Aaliyah a real shot at having you in her life, it has to be honest, all of it. Emma reached across the space between them and took his hand. Her fingers were cold and trembling, but her grip was firm. I want that, she said. I want you and Aaliyah and Sunday dinners and bedtime stories. I want a life that means something beyond profit margins and board meetings. I spent 10 years building an empire because I didn't know how to build anything else. I'm ready to learn. Marcus looked at their joined hands, at the way her fingers fit between his. The road ahead wouldn't be simple. There were wounds that needed time, trust that needed to be rebuilt, piece by piece. But for the first time since he'd seen her in that hallway, he let himself believe they might actually find their way back. The months that followed were a slow reconstruction. Emma stepped back from her day-to-day role as CEO, appointing a trusted executive to handle operations while she focused on what she called her real work. She kept volunteering at the school, reading to Aaliyah's class every Tuesday and Thursday, but now she also came to soccer games, school plays, and ordinary Tuesday nights when the only thing happening was the three of them sharing leftovers. Aaliyah flourished. She stopped asking if Miss Emma would come back and started asking what they would do together next. She drew pictures of their family, 3 figures holding hands under a crooked sun, and taped them to the fridge alongside her older art. When she thought no one was listening, she practiced saying "Mom" under her breath, testing the word. Marcus and Emma got married on a Saturday afternoon in the backyard of their new house, a modest 3-bedroom that Emma insisted on buying with her money, and Marcus insisted on renovating with his hands. Aaliyah walked ahead of them as the flower girl, taking her job so seriously you'd think the petals were precious stones. The guest list was small, just a few friends, co-workers, and Mrs. Patterson, who cried happily and told anyone who would listen that she'd known from that first parent-teacher night these two were meant to find their way back to each other. That evening, after the guests left and Aaliyah collapsed into bed, worn out from all the excitement, Marcus and Emma stood on the back porch of the home they now shared, looking out at the yard where they'd just promised forever. You know what I keep thinking about?" Emma asked, leaning into his side. "What's that?" he said, resting his chin lightly on her hair. "That night at the school when I saw you in the hallway." She let out a soft laugh. "I'd spent years imagining what I'd say if I ever got another chance. And when it finally happened, I couldn't remember a single word." Marcus wrapped an arm around her shoulders. "I remember thinking you looked like you belonged to a completely different world." "I did," Emma admitted. "But it turns out that world was pretty empty." She tilted her face up toward his. "This is better. This small, messy, complicated life we're building. It's worth more than everything I thought I wanted." Marcus kissed her forehead, tasting the salt of grateful tears. "Welcome home," he murmured. And for the first time in 10 years, both of them believed it.